This is History 6. And we have to put our finger today on the place where history either happens or doesn't happen. And it's very difficult to identify this particular place, but I think that we can do it with a little bit of help from our education. We've talked about how it's human nature, given the world in which we live, the nature in which we have all occurred, the cultures, the societies, the civilizations which we have been immersed in for thousands of years. The effects of all of these parfait layerings of conditions and circumstances and situations have contributed so that not only do our psyches in a conscious sense have structure, but on a deeper level there are universal patterns to conceptions, to ideas. And even on a more fundamental level, perception itself has stylizations. Actions have stylizations. And so we find ourselves in a heavily striated situation, in a condition which has many levels of not only expectations, but of demands, and one could even say of structural demands that must be there. So where in all of this complexity could one put one's finger on the fundamental problem in history? It's only through something like our education, which patiently, now for over a year and a half, has built our sensitivity and tutored our sense of alertness, engendered our awareness, and refined our consciousness to the point to where we can now point and we can say, this is it. This is the central issue. This is the make or break point. This is the threshold where we either continue and advance or we regress. It's simple to say what that point is, but in order to really make it come through, we have to review a little bit of our education. The point is simply this: ritual is a secure basis for human beings, whereas myth is a very unstable basis. Not that myth itself is unstable, qua myth, but myth as a basis is unstable. And so human beings have sought to establish again and again, in times of the challenge of history, which is also a process like myth, have sought to have a ritual basis for their stability, for their comfort, for their certainty. And by choosing a ritual basis upon which to address oneself to historical problems, you lose. It's not that you lose because you're not talented, you lose because the structure is against you. You cannot win. In other words, it's a loaded dice situation. The moment that a historical challenge is met by ritual, you have lost. It doesn't matter how genuine you are, how sincere you are, how well-founded it is, how deeply inculcated it is. Ritual is not a basis upon which one can deal with the historical challenge. But to identify this is extremely difficult. To cure this is even more difficult. The cure is to shift the basis, not from a regression back to ritual, but to mature it to a basis in symbol. by having a basis in symbols, one can deal with history. But as soon as the stability is shifted to ritual, you have lost. And there's no way to keep it in the instabilities of myth. Myth is not at all a stable, static, and objective phase. Myth is a fluid phase, and you cannot build upon water. So the choice, the place where one has to put the finger, the choice is between ritual and symbol, between an exterior world and an interior world, between the objectivities of existence and the objectivities of mind. The objectivities of mind are an adequate basis to deal with the differential process of history. The objectivities of ritual comportment, even though they are the fundaments of existence itself, are an inadequate basis upon which to deal with history, and you lose every single time. Now, how can we understand this? What is it that our education has done? If we just say to someone, you have to base yourself on good ideas, you have to base yourself on matured symbols, to most people, this doesn't have very much of a meaning. It sounds like pablum. Or it sounds precarious, as if one then is opting for a kind of a doctrine approach to life. And that propaganda and PR supporting some kind of a doctrine basis is what you're talking about. And this is not it at all. So we need to review this frame of reference that we have come to call in our education the square of attention. It's as simple as there being a picture, and the picture has a frame. Yes, there can be pictures with round frames, but the basic geometricity is that for stability, one has a square, one has a frame. And it is through this frame that one sees the images. And it is this frame, this square of attention, which is like a universal constant. It turns out, in terms of consciousness, that it would be a universal constant no matter what planet one lived on, no matter what star system you live in. The Centauri star system is a quadruple star system, and even there, our ancient descendants of the far future will have to learn just like we're learning, because it's a fundamental universal quality. When one gets beyond the development of the natural ecology, one can go beyond this only at the expense of nature itself. One cannot go beyond the fullness of nature. We saw that in the symbols section of the course. We looked at it again in the vision section of the course, that there is a fundamental universal closure that happens. St. Teresa of Avila, who's one of our authors that we're dealing with today, calls it the soul's center. And she says that when we have gained the tremendous stability of the soul's center, it is like a permanent, an eternally permanent quiet. But she also points out that what surrounds and complements this eternally potent quiet of the soul's center is an increased turmoil in the world. That to the extent that an individual finds their soul center, they then engender around them an increasing activity in the external world, which approaches that of almost a divine warfare. that the more that you center your soul, the more you affect this particular world in its polarity. So that someone who has this kind of ultimate soul quiet is surrounded by a world in turmoil. The archetype that St. Teresa holds up is Jesus. The perfect calm of Jesus' soul is surrounded by the Roman Empire in complete turmoil. The world wrapped in warfare that went on for almost a century. And so too one finds individually that the more you quiet yourself, the more you find yourself embroiled in a chaotic, maddening imbroglio, that the world seems to respond as if the demons of the world are taking great umbrage at the fact that you have achieved quiet, and they're out to destroy it, they're out to challenge it, and the situation becomes one that's very characteristic in any therapy. As soon as you start to improve, the situation around you worsens. It's a universal law. Jung expressed it once by saying, as soon as you go into the interior world, what you find, first of all, is the shadow. And as you gain the self, though the self has its eternal quality, the ego more and more becomes an adversarial, Mephistophelian kind of a function and makes a deal with the devil. It's the ego who signs the little compact in blood. Says, I want to have things. The upshot of this is very difficult to pen without our education. It's this. There is, in the development of nature, a kind of an alternate, it's like an alternating current. There's a syncopation where a phase of process is followed by a phase of objectivity. It's almost like the two legs upon which reality walks. It's the two hands by which wholeness is able to be held. It's the focus. It's the amplitude. It's a universal structure. And it comes to us because it comes unbidden, because we essentially begin in the process of nature. And nature, as we saw, in no way can be objectified. The need to objectify nature is a relentless pursuit of the infinite, both large and small. Nature does not ever stand still. No matter how small you get, there's something more. No matter how large you get, there's something more. The only equanimity possible in nature is a horizon of equanimity at the exact center. The only quiet place in the entire universe is the horizon of equanimity, which is the plane of exact center, and that plane of exact center shrinks to a point which someone like St. Teresa would call the soul center. So that equanimity is there in the soul, no doubt. Not only can one experience it, one can find it repeatedly. One can create situations where others can find it repeatedly and experience it. To some extent, almost anyone who masters a complex involvement in experience finds that equanimity. The race car driver who finds a kind of a quiet inner balance at 200 miles an hour. The tennis player who, in all of the dynamic of game after game, set after set, finds that kind of centered quiet. Any professional athlete knows you have to stay within yourself in order to master the game. It's as simple as that, as universal as that. But that inner equanimity, that soul point, that spiritual quiet, only takes place within an inner realm, an inner world, an interiority. St. Teresa calls it, in one of her great books, the interior castle. And only there at the center of that interior castle, that architecture of the inner quality of oneself, only there is there quiet. But the whole law of polarity is that as soon as you establish one quality, its complement, its exact opposite, obtains everywhere else. So that when calmness is established in only one point, every other point has non-calmness. And the further from that point, the more the non-calmness generates into freneticness. And so one has an increasing sphere of chaos that establishes itself. And so one comes into this kind of a ultimate conundrum. It is the puzzle, it is the mystery, it is the question, why cannot the quiet be resonated out and thus calm the universe? And this is the whole direction, the whole elan, the whole purpose of consciousness, to be that resonance of quiet. But while consciousness in its resonance is certainly quiet, consciousness qua consciousness, consciousness in itself, pure and simple, is very quiet. It has the soul's quietness. But it comes into contact with it, interfaces like a vibration goes through a chaotic structure that surrounds it. And so it seeks to transform, to change that world around it. And here it finds a limitation by the square of attention. Square of attention is this, repeating it again. We can only keep track of 4 phases at any one time. When we were completely just natural, the process of nature was a given. The process of existence was the first objectivity that came out of this. And that objectivity is characterized by what atoms do, what molecules do. Their ritual action produces a realm of objectivity so that things come to exist. There's such a thing not only as atoms and molecules, but minerals, plants, animals, us. All objectivity, anything that is extant, anything that has existence, that exists as a thing, is this objectivity which matures out of the process of nature. And when it comes to the end of its time of objectivity, it goes back into nature. But we've seen that this whole process of this return from existence back into the process of nature, this ecology of return, extends itself to another resonance. Rather than just have a short ecology of nature and an extant inorganic atom and then going back to nature, that whole ecology can be extended another sphere, another rung. One can have not just something which exists, but an existence that goes beyond the inorganic and becomes organic. But organic existence doesn't stay in the ritual level. It generates that level that we would call myth, the level of experience, the level of feeling. Because organic matter has this propensity, has this capacity, has this quality of generating experience. Organics make experience. They have life forms. They have careers of evolution and development. And within that whole huge realm, is all of our feeling, all of our experience, and the medium that carries for us that whole mythic level is one of language. Our feeling, our experience, our process of life is characterized by a language, by language itself. Not just the English language I'm able to speak, but one can see that the ritual gestures of a hand can be made into a language, like signing. Or movements can be made into not just ritual, but can have a language, like dance would have a language to it. So in this larger sense, the process of language parallels that of the process of nature. And just as the objectivity of external things comes out of nature, the objectivity of internal things comes out of language. Language has a tendency to internalize, to interiorize. And as it interiorizes, it makes that kind of a space we call the mind. And so the mind has an objectivity, just like existence does. And in all of this development, in this whole scheme of the ecology of integration, nature is the mode, the ultimate mode, which guarantees that all of this is true, that all of this is real, that it's actual. But we've noticed that at the very core, at that moment of quiet, at that place where interiority condenses and intensifies, it comes to a flash point that the center, in its objectivity, continues to do what it does best, and that is to integrate. And that when you carry integration ultimately to a single point, the point itself does not stop there. Its objectivity is based upon integration, and so it continues to integrate. And so one integrates itself to zero. So one of the great lessons that men and women for many tens of thousands of years have learned is that one can have an interior quiet to the point of ultimate silence. There is no more language. Not only is there no more language that occurs, but there's no language that is needed, that is necessary. And so that interior point that we could say, using a 1990s astronomical kind of a model, that oneness of the ultimate compactness of interior things, that single or singularity, as one would call it in astrophysics, collapses upon itself and makes what we would call a ultimately miniature black hole within. One comes to a zero within. The old way in which the Zen portrayal of it was just simply a white panel. One of the great Zen masters, Takuan, who was a great artist, did a series of 10 paintings of trying to find this wild bull of oneself and learning how to tame it and how to ride it and how to identify with it and to carry the identity to the point of singleness and how to carry singleness into the vanishing. And so in the 9th panel of Takuan's 10 Bulls, it's called in Japan, it's completely blank. One comes to a complete blankness. In the film of Dune, David Lynch had this beautiful sequence where Paul Muad'Dib, who takes the transforming substance from Arrakis, has this moment of the screen blanking out. And yet it's not a dead end. What happens is that integration transforms. It transforms by the law of opposites into its opposite. What is that opposite? What is the opposite of integration? The opposite is differentiation. And so what comes into play is a mode of differentiation that is equal to the whole mode of integration. It's like in the world of existence, all of the matter that we are familiar with is perfectly balanced in reality by antimatter. And there is as much antimatter as there is matter. For each particle in matter, there is an antiparticle. And that antimatter exists just like matter does, has a reality, has its evolution of atoms and molecules and minerals and so on. But the world of differentiation is not an antimatter world, but occurs in this world, but occurs as its complementary opposite. So that when consciousness, as a realistic wave, comes out, it encounters a world that doesn't recognize it at all and yet has to respond to it. And so the higher power structures of this world take great umbrage at someone who has consciousness. Not just because they are, quote, trouble causers, because they want to change things, but even on the fundamental structural level, that the structures of this world they're not friendly to transformation, because it means giving up their actuality. Not only do they have to just change, but they have to change in terms that are foreign to them. Now, the cycle of nature has as its square of attention a basis of nature. It has the development of ritual, of myth, and of symbol. So that square is there. It's a universal form. As soon as consciousness begins to work, begins to function, as soon as that transformation happens, and it's not a transposition at all, Teresa makes a big point. She says, conjunction, union, is not at all the same as a spiritual marriage. That just having a union is like a state of betrothal. It has the promise, whereas the spiritual marriage has a completely different nature. One encounters then something that one had not seen before. As soon as vision, as soon as consciousness, which is another process, like nature is a process, or myth is a process, as soon as consciousness, as soon as the visionary process comes into play, to the extent that that comes into play, it displaces myth, or nature, rather. So at the basis, it's almost like the I Ching that builds up from the base, that builds up its structure from the base. Nature allows for vision to come in and displace it. So that as nature is displaced by vision, vision more and more tends to want to work with myth rather than just work with nature. And so as one becomes more and more conscious, one naturally becomes, it's like developing a taste for experience. Consciousness begins to prefer experience to just simply letting nature happen. And so as consciousness becomes more and more affine to experience, to feeling, consciousness develops not only a taste for, but one could almost say a need for feeling-toned experience to complement it, to go with it. Now, vision, when it forms a basis, naturally develops its own objectivity. And the objectivity that comes out of consciousness is the person, the artist who makes themselves, who as a differential form comes into play quite objectively. And the person is quite real, just as real as things are, just as real as symbols are. But as soon as the person comes into play, the person has the tendency to displace ritual. Just as vision displaced nature, now art displaces ritual. And we saw in our education that this is an extremely uncomfortable situation for most people. The precariousness of being an artist in this world is not just because art is so difficult to practice, but because there is an existential jeopardy that structurally happens. It's built into the very nature of this process. One's whole existence becomes challenged by the creator within. And that creator within seeks to have some kind of a basis, some kind of an alliance. Just as vision got a taste for myth, now the artist gets a taste for something else, gets a taste for the development of its own process that it engenders by coming more differentially into play in the world. And so the person begins to prefer their life, prefers the quality that their life becomes interesting to them. What they do as a person is of interest. What other people do as their own persons becomes of interest. And so history is like this sense where the process of conscious lives begins to become more appealing. And what loses its appeal is the ritual comportment. The standardized actions which make objectivity certain, possible, recognizable, trustworthy. And so a natural precariousness comes out the more that one's person begins to develop. And your own body tells you in its own way that you're embarking on a perilous course. Your own body tells you, from its integral standpoint, it makes perfectly good sense, that you're playing with dynamite. Because you're going to lose the stability which you have. And so your body begins to react to this. And it reacts on a perfectly natural basis, because the body does not recognize transcendence at all. At first, it doesn't have any way of understanding this. And if you try to use some kind of a metaphysics by saying, well, you're developing an astral body, your real body, your natural body will tell you where to go and what to do with that. Yeah. We're not feeding any astral bodies today. And so this built-in reaction to this kind of metaphysical story which tries to be told to the body knows it's not true at all and never will believe it. But also, existence objects to this. Existence is based upon the integral cycle, and the person is a differential form. And so existence says, I don't know you. I don't know your kind. Who are you? So that differential forms become very suspect. And so the individual person becomes a curse to the tribe. The more individual you are, the more that you stand out, the less the tribe wants to have to do with you. You're not like us. Get out. You don't do things the way we do things. We're not putting you up. We're not subsidizing you. You're not going to get your share of the hunt. All of these kinds of phrases come into play. So that the person finds at the very moment where there's a triumph of their achievement, the bad news comes into play exactly at the same time. And so there's this peculiar, I used to call it, when I was writing poetry in San Francisco in the 60s, I used to use a Joycean kind of a word that I made up called weird fondness. There's a weird fondness that the person develops where you like something really well, but it's kind of strange. And the more that you like it, the stranger it gets, until you realize that there's something peculiarly wrong here, because the more that you like things, the more weird they get. It's like a Midas curse that as you touch something deeper and deeper, it becomes more and more surreal. And so the person gets caught into this kind of it's almost like a science fiction film, where the world that you recognized and you knew no longer happens, and an absurd world takes its place. And the more convinced you are that you're just going to tough it out, you're going to willfully go through it, you're going to discipline yourself, you're going to learn techniques, the more that you do this, the more the absurdity of the world becomes a complete chaos. One of the great voices of the 20th century, Samuel Beckett, whose plays disclose this kind of weird fondness conundrum. One of his most famous plays, Waiting for Godot, was waiting for the friend who's going to come and confirm that we're okay never comes. But the most poignant of Beckett's plays is Endgame, where the characters on the stage live in garbage cans. The only place where they're safe temporarily is in their garbage cans. And they pop out from time to time to have these short little phrase interchanges. You can hardly call them conversations, because at this point you don't know what's real. You don't know what you can trust. You don't even know if what you're saying is real, or whether you can trust what you're saying, much less what they're hearing, much less what you're hearing. And so you get into this situation that Beckett calls endgame. It is an absurdity that comes to a terminal dead end. It's a superimposed limbo, and the limbo happens to extend like a corrosion exactly where equanimity had been. And so consciousness comes to recognize that there's like a universal curse that happens with transformation. They never told you, did they? Well, yes, the tribe told you. They said, don't do this. This is the way that we do things, and as long as we do things this way, we're okay, we're safe. Yes, they did tell you, but you went ahead, didn't you? So you hung out with bad people, with bad friends who wanted to do things their way, and now look where it got you. Look where you are. Your only safety is in your personal garbage can. And you don't know how much longer you can hold out. And so consciousness, in its personal quality, gets to this kind of a dead end and realizes then that what has challenged it is the process of historical life. This is where the fault is. The process of history itself has become so overwhelming, and that there's a solution to this. The solution is, instead of going forward, which you cannot do, is to step back and go back and revere the body. Go back to the certainty and security of existence. Go back to the rituals that are tried and true. And you know they worked. They worked for thousands of years, and they're going to work again. And yes, they do work. But one of the great discoveries is that they no longer work for you the way they used to. You cannot count on the same ritual comportments that used to work in nature, because they don't quite work the same way. Once consciousness has been developed, once the differential energies have been loosened, one of the solutions to this, the ego says, the ego being a mythic character of great renown, says, well, we have to wipe out all of these curses of consciousness. We have to blot this out. We have to repress this. We have to fight against this. And out of this comes a whole raft of characteristics which human beings, men and women, have shown time and time again. The need to go back to a ritual basis, the security of the body, the certainty of existence, vis-a-vis the perils of history and of the conscious person. When one comes back to the ritual level, the more that one gains a stability there, the more that the ritual basis extends only so far as ritual, myth, symbol, and vision. And of course, because one has regressed and gone back to ritual, the objectivities of the mind, the ideas, the symbols, all work in kind of a reverse form, a reverse order. Their function now is to make good justifications, good rationalizations for these rituals. And a rationalized ritual is an ideology. It's an ism. That's how they come to be. And isms are notorious in our century. And what is even less recognized, but more notorious, is that all isms are isms. All ideologies have this regressive quality, and they all end up in the dead certainty of a regressed body, which is not now the body that you would have recognized out of nature. It's a body that has emerged out of the process of ideologically informed mythology. Because the objectivity of the body doesn't come directly from the objectivity of the mind, but always comes through the medium of the next phase, the phase next to it, which means that it comes back through a regressive mythology. So that the ideology has changed the mythology, has modified the mythology, so that the body that one comes back to is it's like triply radioactive. It's radioactive because the sabotaged person has been rejected. That person is too far out adventurous, is an outlaw. It comes from a sabotaged vision. It comes from a sabotaged symbol level. So that the mythology by now is crammed with various skews and oblique qualities that it has no way of dealing with. And even if it could be dealt with, myth is a process and not an objectivity. It's the process of feeling, so that feeling becomes junked up with all of these oblique angles. All of these regressive disguises. And so feeling tone, instead of having its own natural integral quality, has now a regressive quality, so that the body that's made out of this, the regressive ritual that comes out of this, is totally destructive. It carries with it the very powerful energies of an end game consciousness. And the body has no natural way of recording this, of digesting this. And so the body begins then to show the telltale signs of what has been imposed upon it. And the body, instead of being a natural existent, begins to have this kind of a demonic form. Very few people willingly go that far back in a regression. They usually get caught in a revulsion before they go that far. But what happens to the revulsion? The revulsion is a revulsion that tries to reverse a regression. But a regression can only be reversed at its origin, at its starting point. That energy has to be gone to wherever the center, the epicenter of that particular earthquake is. You have to go there. That's where you handle it. Historical problems are problems in history. They're not problems in bodies. You can't go to a gymnasium and solve a historical problem. And you can't go to a tribal dance and hope that that's going to stop a nuclear war. That's not it. It's not that the efficacy of the tribal dance doesn't work in nature. Yes, it does. Tribal dances affect nature fantastically. They don't have anything to do with historical problems. So one has to recognize that you're caught into a welter of jigsaw pieces, and not just on a two-dimensional jigsaw, and not just a three-dimensional jigsaw, but it's like a five-dimensional jigsaw of conscious time-space. And when the pieces get jumbled up, it's almost impossible to tell what to do, because you cannot even recognize that there is a to-do that could be done. There's no efficacy of action. At this point, there is a saving grace that comes into play. And after the break, we'll talk about it. Let's take a short break. And so we get to this impasse. We get to this confusion that makes alphabet soups look very simple. We get to a situation where the historical challenge becomes so enormous, and the regressions are not simply guaranteed, so not everyone goes back to the same point. In fact, it's all different points, because one has, at the point of individuality, when you're individual enough to have these kinds of problems, the regressions are also individual, and so you have this cacophony. And so you have a world that is so confused that it seemingly is beyond the ability or the power to bring back into any kind of an order, because you have almost an atomized regression, individualized and tailored to each individual. To put it in popular language, everybody lives in their private hell. There isn't a standard hell any longer where one could be saved out of, but everything is fractally reduced to an impossibility. So how do you deal with this? Well, fortunately, men and women have been wise for a very long time, and there are very good solutions to this. One of the solutions that came about 2,500 years ago in the personage of the historical Buddha was to recognize that there is no regression in a 0 point. From where would a 0 point begin to regress? There's no point there, so there's no regression. So that someone who is completely and perfectly realized does not regress at all. But also there's no regression through a 0 point. It's as if equanimity is so universally non-participatory in the numbers game that it doesn't participate at all, even in a reversed numbers game, of regression. The difficulty here, though, is that so very few people ever became realized enough at their soul center, at their 0 point, that it would make any kind of a difference. But occasionally men and women do. And those men and women do not confuse. That is to say, they not only are beyond being confused, but they do not respond to a confused situation in a confused manner at all, which produces a kind of a surrealism within surrealism, which turns out to be like a double negative, which turns out to be one of these strange blessings. It's like a positive comes out of this, that in a regressed phantasmagoria, a realized center becomes more clear. Now, this is an oddity. St. Teresa of Avila, 500 years ago, in her interior castle, points out that for her, when she came to realize the mystical depths of her true self, of her deep soul center, when she became mystically in tune with her soul center, she found then that it was possible for her to have a spiritual marriage with Christ. So now we speak religiously for just a moment in the words of Teresa. Let's go to her classic, The Interior Castle. She writes in this way. She uses a phrase, the sovereign marriage, that her soul center was able to be into a direct, non-mediated relationship with the soul center of Christ. So that it was a spiritual marriage of soul centers. It wasn't a marriage on a ritual level. It was not a marriage on the mythic level. And technically, though one could say provisionally that it was a marriage on a symbolic level, it was at the very center, the disappearing center of symbols. And so it was at that peculiar 0 point on the symbolic level, which doesn't participate in the symbolic level. Yet, it was also at the same time not a spiritual marriage on the visionary level, on the conscious level, because the differentiation hadn't begun yet. So that spiritual marriage, Teresa says, is a very mysterious ineffability. And what comes out of this is that one's own soul center becomes, in a spiritual marriage, completely unified. It's like two zeros that come together. And on that level, instead of two zeros coming together and being yet another zero, it's like those two zeros come together and become an infinity. And instead of just a 0 point, one has an infinite point. That the soul center in a mystical marriage with someone else's soul center becomes an infinite point. And while an infinite point vanishes out of the integral cycle perfectly, doesn't leave a trace, an infinite point factors into the differential ecology permanently. An eternal point factors infinitely into differential forms and always participates. And so what comes out of that is a very peculiar, mystical adventure. The discovery that one is not only safe from the madness of the world and its regressiveness, but that one has an operative point, an infinite, an eternal point in which one can go back into the fray, go back into the differential ecology and handle it. Handle it like you had mishandled it, now you handle it right. And go back in and direct it. And that the triumph on this level is the triumph of a conscious application of an eternal point into the whole development, the whole ecology of the differential cycle. And that what comes out of this is a further achievement of an objectivity, which is that of the living cosmos. of a spiritual heaven, which is quite objectively real. Now, this, Teresa, when she writes it, she uses this kind of language earlier on. She says that for a beginner, one of the mistakes that one makes, it's like a structural mistake, everyone makes it. She made it. Everyone makes it. Is that it seems when you first find your soul center and you are aware, you realize that this ineffable quietness, this rest in the apocryphal writings of the 1st and 2nd centuries A.D., Jesus is always talking about people entering his rest. You find that again and again, like in the Nag Hammadi material or in the apocryphal books of the New Testament. You find this kind of language used again and again. The invitation to enter my rest. This application for the beginner, Teresa says, comes as a very ordinary kind of a mistaking. She said, it will seem at this beginner stage that the soul can now rest, which then must mean that you can rest, that your life can rest. But she writes, I repeat, it is necessary that your foundation consist of more than prayer and contemplation. Prayer is a language form that interiorizes, so that it uses the mythic process specifically to interiorize. Prayer is an interiorized form of language, and contemplation is the receiving of this interiorized language to the point of condensation where it comes to its center. So prayer shunts the whole mythic process to an interior implosion, and contemplation is the taking of that to the still point of the center of the soul. But Teresa, very wise woman, she established more than 20 spiritual centers in her life. She knew a lot. I repeat, it is necessary that your foundation consist of more than prayer and contemplation. If you do not strive for the virtues and practice them, you will always be dwarfs. It's her kind of language. She lived in the Spain of Cortez, and so you had to talk tough sometimes to people. In other words, if you don't realize that there's also stuff to do, you're always going to be truncated. But what is worse about this is that you do not remain truncated, you continue to shrink. She says, whoever does not increase decreases. That's like a law of nature. And of course, the decrease is the regression, which not only sets in as a regression, but because one has added even one iota of consciousness. Because one has added a dimension. Consciousness, because it's differential, has what one would call in mathematics an algorithmic development. That is, it increases not only arithmetically, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and not only geometrically, but it increases increasingly. Differentiation differentiates differentially. So that its growth, if one could chart it, would be like a 5-dimensional asymptotic zoom. Sometimes in mystical sight, when a very powerful spirit is freed by the death of a body, one gets the image play of a comet or meteor shooting at infinite speed away from the Earth. It's a release of a soul, a release of of spiritual person. And the speed is a speed that just becomes infinite almost instantaneously. So that the regression has this kind of characteristic that it doesn't just regress arithmetically, but it tends to regress more and more. But because it's an integral regression, it doesn't have that asymptotic element. It doesn't have that infinite speed, but it has a geometricity. So that regression tends to breed more regression, but in a kind of a way where one is caught in like a slow motion nightmare. And what's damnable about it is that it continues to go regardless of what you tried to do about it. And so that one of the qualities of that regression is that it's like witnessing your own dismemberment continuously without being able to do anything about it. And it gets worse and worse, that kind of a thing. So St. Teresa says, in effect, status quo in this world is a regression, because the law of polarities always must be dynamic. They are a dynamic. She says, the calm these souls have interiorly is for the sake of their having much less calm exteriorly, and much less desire to have exterior calm. What do you think is the reason for these inspirations? What do you think is the reason for all of these aspirations? Those messages the soul sends from the interior center to people, whether they're at the top of the castle or they're living outside on the periphery, are those messages sent so that they can fall asleep? That's the way that she talks. In other words, the beauty of the soul's messages of calm is not to make you secure or anesthetize you or inure you. If you're expecting a calm life, that's like a total misunderstanding. Well, everything should be better, right? No. Nothing is better. The whole point is that the appeal of the need for betterment like that is a false appeal. It's always a false appeal. People who promise you benefits because of some technique of development are totally naive. If the technique works, things are worse. So the whole context of techniques of development have to be put into an education which prepares you to deal with the new structures and the new energies that are released, that are used. Because nothing is going to work the way it used to. And the more one has effective techniques, the less business as usual is going to even be possible. This is why all real spiritual learning is in an education, not in a metaphysics, not in weekends, not in pleasant little retreats in beautiful little areas, not in any kind of chopped up temporary thing, but an education which allows you to reorder everything, including your own life, in terms of a development, a progression, a phase form maturation that is up to and includes and goes beyond the very level where the problems would really start to occur. So St. Teresa, she says, a spiritual marriage is a transformation. It means that in this transformation, other than a conjunction, instead of there just being a union, just being a meeting, that there is a transformation. The form itself transforms. And she says, for me, I came to realize that my life was Christ. That's what she says. She had to be careful because 500 years ago in Spain, they had a thing called the Inquisition. They stretched you out on boards of nails and kept stretching you. Could you see it's like a ritual misunderstanding of differentiation, right? Well, if we pull your joints apart, it'll be good for you. Idiots. Excuse me. We used worse language in those days. For good reason. She's saying here, she came to realize that her life, as she was then living it, was Christ. Not some iconographic figure on a wall. Not some kind of a mythic image way back when or way out there or anywhere, but that her life itself was Christ. Why? Because she had gone into a spiritual marriage where her soul center and that soul center of Jesus not only came together in a marriage, but transformed together as like an infinite point that then plays itself out where? In that differential continuum. What's the objectivity in that differential continuum? The spiritual person. Consciousness as a process is not objective at all. Consciousness as a process, the stream of consciousness, is no more objective than is nature or language. They're always at play. That's what they do. They play. They play continuously, and that's, quote, their nature. That's the way they should be. Processes process. They're always active. The body is certainly not eternal. No way. Even a body that's made of tailored material, though it can last for a long time, is not going to last forever. Even if you tailor by some kind of super 30th century chemistry, a body made purely out of protons, and it will last for 15 billion years, nevertheless, at the end of that time, it's going to decay. It's going to go. Even protons go. So the body is certainly not eternal. The mind has only one point of eternity, and that's at its absolute zero center, which no longer takes part in the integrating mind, in thought, in ideation. That's not going to do you any good to hope to, play tennis forever from that standpoint. But the spiritual person is quite capable of eternal existence as a differential gestalt. No problem whatsoever, because differential forms are not limited to the conditionals of nature, of the natural cycle at all. Once a spiritual person differentially is formed, how are they going to decay? There's nothing in nature to decay them whatsoever, because they have emerged like a cone of differential light out of a zero-point focus. Even on their own, they would be eternal. But Teresa's talking about a special circumstance, what I call in one of my books that I'll write in the next century called Shared Presence. It's like that transformation is so potent, so remarkably peculiar and powerful that its light cone that comes out doesn't just fan out so that it comes to focus in the person, but fans further out so that the person, in their objectivity, is like a prism for an even farther amplification, for a spectrum of differential achievement that has its focus in an actual cosmos, the real cosmos. Not only all the stars and galaxies that one would see, but all that one cannot see on whatever frequencies, whatever dimensions. World without end. One recognizes the phrase even from the old formulations of it. But even the phrase world without end is still limited conception compared to what we could understand now, verged on the 21st century. We can understand differentially, fractally evolved possibilities that make infinity seem like a very small thing, the way it used to be thought of. Already 500 years ago, St. Teresa of Avila is already saying she's living in this way. But Teresa lived in a world that was constantly garroted by a very set form of cultural and civilized rituals and myths and symbols and ideologies that took what she said and absorbed it in its own way. And though she was like a very pure water, the sponge that absorbed it was not very pure. It was a world that one could call, I'll use a phrase that I made up one time to characterize it so it was more recognizable. It was a world of Cortez consciousness. If they get in our way, we will just simply flatten them and then take over everything. When Cortez was able finally to get clear about what he was going to do, he burned his ships. And Alvarado said, well, I think this is a strategic mistake. And Cortez said, no. He said, men who have any chance whatsoever to go back, that is to regress from the willful purpose that he has, he said, we'll take it. They have no hope now except for ultimate success. There's no resting for them until we take Tenochtitlan. And then when he had taken the Aztec Empire, his phrase to his men, this is just a beginning. We're going to take over the whole world from here. And in order to show that he was in control, the gold that was sent back from the New World was sent specifically through ships that went through the Pillars of Hercules into southern Spain. And those two Pillars of Hercules were with the great S for Spain, and that's where the dollar sign came from. And the dollar sign is Cortez's personal emblem that this is like a world empire on a very serious level. That what we're after is not just some ideological empire, but we're after the very monetary basis of the way in which the world works. We know for the last 200 years this is called political economy. Yeah. And the guy who made the term up, Jeremy Bentham, in the Britain of the late early 1800s, meant it. Bentham also very famous at the time for his development of the theory of fictions. Economics is very deep. Very deep. It's a science. What happens here for us is that Cortez consciousness, which is like a Roman empire reborn again through an ideological I guess you would say a projection, but actually it's a procession. It's a tableau of expectations that survived unendingly through the ages, so that rather than being a projection from a subconscious psyche, was yet another tableau in an unending tableau that goes back to the Roman Empire. And there in the Roman Empire, at the very beginnings of the Roman Empire, one finds the way in which that particular knot was tied. That one can actually deal with the situation historically. In other words, history is not only a perilous process that gives us all of these difficulties, it is like any kind of a process. It is capable of as much good as it has been. And history also is a process where one can understand and come to see exactly how all of this started in the first place, because the regression comes from a certain point, and the regression is not just because one has a personal regression. The cultures have a regression too that are tied up, but the master regression is tied up with the regression of civilization. And the regression is a regression of the Roman Empire at its founding. And for that, we pair up with Teresa of Avila, we pair up the great Roman historian Tacitus, who was a personal eyewitness, not to the founding of the Roman Empire, but to that whole first 120 years where the reverberations of what had happened played itself out. And he was actually a participant in it. Tacitus was not only a consul, he was like one of the two men who ran the military for a year or two for the whole empire. He was also the governor of Asia. He was the governor of that area of the world that included not only Turkey and Syria, Palestine, Judea. He understood that while Augustus Caesar, who had founded the Roman Empire, was extremely brilliant and knew how to handle what we would today call the strategies of political economy, his successors increasingly were unable to handle it. And so his successor line played itself out literally into a differential madness, a craziness, the craziness of the later Caesars, Caligula. I guess Nero is finally the ultimate crazy man. In order to prove that he was master of Rome, he burnt Rome to the ground so he could rebuild it exactly in his own way. And the upshot of this was that not only was Nero killed and put out of the way, but the whole Caesar line was completely effaced. But the problem was, who do you bring in to run the Roman Empire since the Caesars are no longer in charge? And the person who was brought in founded a new dynasty, the Flavian dynasty. And that person was Vespasian. And Tacitus, in his histories, points out in two separate places, about 130 pages apart, exactly the regressive progression, if I can use that term, by which Vespasian brought the Roman Empire into play in such a form that it survived not only to Cortez's time, but to our own time, still intact, still there. Still there. Napoleon used to dress his troops with the plumed helmets and capes of the Roman Empire. He felt he was the new emperor. They called him the emperor. What is Beethoven's symphony? The Emperor Concerto. Tacitus says when Vespasian was first nominated to be Roman emperor by his troops, by the military, because you see, war and military and money are all tied up with the way in which this form is made, this regressive form. He says when he was first nominated by his troops, Vespasian was very careful to emphasize that he was a soldier among soldiers. And he had the unremitting respect of his troops because they understood that he was like a simple soldier. Not just an Eisenhower-type figure, but like a Patton figure. A general who was a man among men. Here's how Tacitus phrases it in just a few sentences. When his couriers brought news from Syria and Judea that the East had sworn allegiance to him, the competing emperor Vitellius had this tremendous vanity and indolence, which reached a peak which was almost incredible. For already, though the rumors were still vague and unreliable, Vespasian's name was in everybody else's mouth. And the mention of him, just the mention of his name, was like an electric shock to Vitellius. But now he and his army seemed that they were going to put down with unbridled cruelty, debauchery, and oppression any competition. Vespasian, on the other hand, was meditating war and reckoning all his forces, both distant and near at hand. He had so much attached his troops to himself that when he dictated to them the oath of allegiance, he temporarily made them swear allegiance to Vitellius, who was technically the emperor. And all the troops took this oath in silence. Then they made this tremendous speech to him that he should seize the empire because the Caesar lineage was over, and Vespasian was the most qualified person to run the empire because it had to be held up by military force. Then 130 pages later, Tacitus finally gets around to where Vespasian was actually taking power just a few months later, and the whole scene, the whole tone has changed. The regression has gone all the way back to where a kind of a mythic, symbolic, archetypal energy is controlling everything. During the month, and all this happened in Alexandria, during the months which Vespasian spent at Alexandria, waiting for the regular season of the summer winds to ensure a safe voyage, that is to sail across the Mediterranean north, you have to have winds behind you to go. You can't sail against the winds blowing from the north. So they had to wait till the summer winds. There occurred many miraculous events manifesting the goodwill of heaven and a certain favor of providence towards him. So that Vespasian is going to be the recipient now of all the messianic energy of the age. He's literally going to be called the Messiah, who will save the earth, save mankind from this archetypal regression that is set in with the decay of the Caesar line. At Alexandria, a commoner whose eyes were well known to have wasted away, on the advice of the god Serapis, fell at Vespasian's feet, demanding with sobs a cure for his blindness, and imploring that the emperor would deign to moisten his eyes and eyeballs with the spittle from his own mouth. Another man with a maimed hand, also inspired by the god Serapis, besought Vespasian to imprint his foot mark on it and thus heal it. At first Vespasian laughed and refused, but they insisted. The crowds grew. He half feared a reputation for gullibility, but was also half moved to hope by their petition and the flattery of courtiers, and of course the crowds growing. He eventually told the doctors to form an opinion whether such cases of blindness and deformity could be remedied by human aid. The doctors discussed, and they said that it was not humanly possible. And so Vespasian was convinced finally that it all hinged on whether there were any limits to his destiny. And he decided that nothing now was impossible to him. Nothing was any longer incredible to him. To the great excitement of the bystanders, he stepped forward with a smile on his face and did as the two men requested. Immediately, The hand recovered its functions, and daylight shone once more in the blind man's eyes. Those who were present still attest to both miracles today, and there is nothing to gain by lying. This occurrence deepened Vespasian's desire to visit the holy place himself and consult Serapis the god about the fortunes of empire. Now, both these miracles, the lame shall walk, the blind shall see, are miracles ascribed to Jesus also. So they're current in the archetypal atmosphere. So Vespasian gains this kind of messianic mantle, but he recognizes through aides who whisper to him, you have a competitor. The competitor is not at all Vitellius or anybody else in the Roman Empire, but a messianic figure who already is being talked about as having these attributes. And so Vespasian, in order to efface the competition from the face of the earth, orders his son Titus to completely destroy the city of Jerusalem and any trace of it, so nobody will ever talk about a possible competitor to the messianic field. And so Titus, who was 29 at the time, began the siege of Jerusalem, not simply to show the Jews who was boss. They had known about Roman power since Pompey's day. Herod the Great was very loyal subject to Augustus Caesar. Herod Antipas, his successor, very loyal to Tiberius. In fact, they built a city for him with Jewish financing called Caesarea on the Mediterranean. The Jews never had any problem understanding Roman power. The true reason for destroying Jerusalem was to efface the possible messianic competition, the memory of it, or that anybody would give any credence to anybody who had proclaimed this or who had aspired to this in the city of Jerusalem. Where is that claim now? Look at Jerusalem. And so the archetypal symbol of Jewish power in Jerusalem, the messianic confirming power, which was there in the temple, the great menorah that was there in the temple in Jerusalem, was the only artifact that was saved, and it was taken to Rome. And it was melted down in Rome to form some gold for decorations for the gods. But the commemoration of that was to build this great Arch of Titus in Rome, the entrance to the Roman Forum, where the Senate is and the augurs and the sacred temples and the law courts, where Roman power was. So the entrance to Roman power was through this Arch of Titus, and at the keystone you see the great menorah from the temple. So that Jewish esoteric power in symbolic form is the keystone of the arch to the entrance to the Roman Empire Forum, ever after that. So that the pogrom that was given against Judaism and against early Christianity is on the basis of getting rid of competition. The Roman Empire never had any problem with different religions. There were thousands of religions. That was never the problem. The problem was effective competition, because the whole new Roman Empire was based upon the image of them having the occult power. We have it. Our empire is holy. We have every right to rule the earth because we hold the Godhead, and we have the only link and the only tie that's effective there. But notice the flaw in the whole works. The flaw is that no Roman Empire has a head, has an emperor who entered into a spiritual marriage. So the big weak spot in the whole thing, archetypally, is some kind of spiritual woman who's capable of a spiritual marriage with the Godhead. There's no way that the Roman Empire is able to, in any form, guard themselves against that. It's a fatal flaw. So any lineage based upon a spiritual woman capable of a universal marriage was completely and effectively not talked about. And the only possible candidate was not made the wife of God, but the mother. Oh, well, it's the mother. And as long as the energy is all shunted to the mother, the lover capable of a spiritual marriage is not even recognized or talked about. It's a fatal flaw in the whole empire idea. We're going to come back next week and talk a little bit more about Tacitus, a little bit more about St. Teresa. But remember that part of the process here is an education. This isn't a series of lectures on a university course, although this is one of the better university courses that you could have. This is about you getting educated. And what you're doing now is writing your own history of the last 2 years. Because as you come to write your history of the last 2 years, you come into play with all of those energies that are there for advancement or for resistance. But you're doing it in a context where there are other people here. One of the great discoveries of men and women throughout the ages is that there is an infinite resonance from someone who has already participated in a soul-centered spiritual marriage. Those helping capacities are there permanently and eternally from someone who has already done that. So that we have not only our own courage, but we have the tailwind, the elan of those before who had already accomplished that. They're still able to be here. They're still allies. And there are many, not just a few. And so the education here at the end of the 20th century takes cognizance of this whole capacity, that the courage of the individual can be augmented and supplemented by the achievement of a community of spirits that's very much alive. Their lives are without end, and so how is there any kind of termination? Rather than being metaphysics, this is actually a science. We'll come back and we'll take a look at the development of the historical basis of it more next week. Thank you.